Next up is the story of the most Soviet-American fighter aircraft ever made, the Bell P-39 Airacobra. Surprisingly, the P-39 wasn't a very popular pick in the US Air Force. Some pilots hated it so much that they intentionally broke it in the hope of getting a replacement in the form of a Lightning, a Mustang, or a Thunderbolt. The US shipped the Airacobras to the British, but it turned out that the Brits weren't big fans either. Eventually, these aircraft made it to the USSR, and for the Soviet pilots, it was love at first sight. How could this happen? It wasn't a bad aircraft after all, far from it. What was it that the Red Army pilots could see in it, and others couldn't? Heck, just look at Alexander Pokrishkin, one of the top aces of the Allies. He preferred the Airacobra to any other plane. Maybe the Soviet-made fighters were that bad? Not really. Some accidental fights between the Allied aircraft clearly showed that the Soviet planes were nothing to sneeze at. Maybe it's because these planes provided the Soviets with the means of reliable radio communication. In fact, the USSR had an option of obtaining a practically infinite number of compact and powerful American radio stations and then installing them on Soviet fighters. What was the reason then? Maybe the US were intentionally selling only the bad tech, the tech they didn't want themselves. Wrong again. America offered the USSR anything it could possibly want because Stalin would have to pay for it. And not with a dollar, but with pure gold. So it was in the best interests of the US to sell every top-notch fighter and bomber, every new technology available. It would be outdated in a couple of years anyway. The North American Aviation, for example, was promoting its magnificent P-51 with everything they had. They were sending every single new modification to the USSR, until there was a clear message coming from Moscow: we don't want the Mustang. The Lockheed Corporation offered the Soviets the P-38 Lightning, with the same result. Even the United Kingdom was keen on getting some of that Soviet gold and offered their northern allies the Spitfires and Typhoons. And keep in mind, the Royal Air Force lacked good fighters until very late in the war, and the Boeing and the Consolidated would gladly sell an extra 100 or 2 of the B-17s or the B-24s. But the Soviet High Command demanded the Airacobra again and again. So, what did they see in it that the Allies have missed? Here's what. In every war involving aircraft, there is always a certain class of a warplane that defines it, and all other planes are built around that. In Western Europe and in the Pacific, such a leading design was defined in the very first few days of the war, and it was a heavy bomber with a big combat radius. The US and Great Britain created whole families of those four-engined monsters that were flying at impossible altitudes to keep themselves away from the enemy aircraft guns. They had to be protected from enemy fighters, and that's what those Mustangs, Lightnings, and Thunderbolts were really good at. They had drop fuel tanks, powerful high-altitude engines, and turbo superchargers that were crazy expensive at the time. All this gear helped the plane to perform well at high altitudes and, basically, allowed it to escort the bombers anywhere. And the low-altitude Airacobra, with its Allison engine and a measly gear-driven centrifugal supercharger, couldn't possibly compete with them. But in the skies of the Eastern Front, the situation was completely different. The core aircraft was not a bomber, but a mass-produced close air support aircraft, like the Il-2, for example. This armored beast would fly at ground-hugging altitude, almost hitting Nazi helmets with its propeller and destroying everything in its path. The extremely low altitudes were also the domain of tactical dive bombers like the PE-2 and the fearsome P-02. Naturally, Soviet pilots preferred the American aircraft that would fare just as well under these conditions. Aircraft like the B-25 or the A-20. Of course, those needed some fighters to escort them as well. But here's the catch. Why would you want a turbo supercharge that costs more than the rest of the plane's gear to fight at altitudes below 5,000 meters? There was simply no need to have those. The Airacobra, with its gear-driven centrifugal supercharger, would do just fine. There's also a problem with weather. That wasn't the Pacific, where the sky was always crystal clear. In the European part of the USSR, it was cloudy 300 days of the year. and that covers everything from a few stray clouds to an impenetrable grey shroud which offered zero visibility. Are you a fan of vertical maneuvering? Then welcome to the grave, son. The horizontal turning flight was the way to go. And when it came to it, the Airacobra performed really well. You just needed an experienced pilot. For the Soviet aviators that learned how to fly on the E-16, that was a piece of cake. That's partially why the Germans used to say, "Non-flying weather is when the Russians are most dangerous in the skies." And that landing gear, oh boy, it did its job on almost any surface, and that was the only thing that mattered. There was also that 37mm gun that could destroy almost enemy aircraft with a single shot. What do you say? The Mustang has 6 guns? Huh, so what? They still weren't as deadly. The Airacobra was a kind of ugly duckling in the West, but in the USSR, it became a star. There were poems and songs written about it, and it was a dream for many Soviet pilots to fly it one day. Actually, it was so good that its manufacturer, the Bell Aircraft Corporation, created an even better fighter of the same type, the P-63 King Cobra. The USA didn't need it? Not a problem. But it's a story for another time.